This year marks the 40th anniversary of diplomatic relations between China and the U.S. It's been 4 decades of ups and downs, but one thing people can agree on: nobody wants to see a Cold War again between the world's 2 largest economies. During difficult times, relations do take a breather. There are times diplomats hold talks, other times they use the universal language of music. Ambassador Nicholas Platt helped bring American Orchestra to China for the very first time in 1973. It was a time before China and the U.S. officially normalized the relations. They overcame many obstacles to make happen. When legendary conductor Eugene Ormandy raised his baton in front of the Chinese audiences, the power of music crossed boundaries and differences. Earlier this year, as the Philadelphia Orchestra returned to China for its 12th tour, I caught up with Ambassador Platt, who is now in his late 80s already. We took a trip down memory lane. "1973, you were instrumental in making sure the first ever performance of the Philadelphia Symphony Orchestra to China. You were young at the time.
36 years old.
Oh my God, think about it.
Yeah.
What was it like? The negotiation process difficult with the Chinese authorities?
Yes, it was a very, very painstaking. And we had all kinds of details, etc., which were set in place. But there was one big issue that was not resolved, and that was which of Beethoven's symphonies should be played. And the Chinese side very much wanted Beethoven's 6th Symphony. And
did they tell you why?
They didn't. But it was up to me to explain to Mr. Ormandy why. In any case, he said, "I don't like that symphony and I'm not going to play it." And
as an artist,
that was
very determined.
And I said to him, "Maestro, you know, the authorities in China have given us a strong request from the very top to play Beethoven's 6th. He said, "You know I hate that symphony." And I said, "Well, let me try and explain to you why it is that the Chinese love the Pastoral Symphony. First of all, the Chinese love program music. In other words, music that's about things, places, scenery, etc., etc. And Beethoven's 6th is one of the great pieces of program music. It's all about life in the countryside. And here you have the Chinese Communist Party coming to power on the back, and that sounds to them like the revolution. And then you have a big, peaceful 5th movement ending of the symphony, and that represents to the Chinese the victory of the Communist Party. Ormandy looked at me and he said, "Okay, well, when in Rome, I should do as the Romans wish. But you have to get me the scores." So I got 70 scores from Shanghai and 50 scores from Beijing. They were all marked up differently, but the orchestra knew the symphony cold, and they also knew to watch the maestro, and he played it. They played it very beautifully.
At the end of the day, did the maestro also enjoy that trip?
At the end of the day, when I said goodbye to the maestro, someone poked me and they said, "You know, the maestro really doesn't need a plane to get back to the United States.
He could literally fly back."
He could just fly back.
Feeling very much elevated
Yes.
throughout the process.
Yes.
Did you still remember, what was it like that this initiative to bring Philadelphia Symphony Orchestra to China was brought up?
Well, I think that in the overall bigger picture, we found from our relations with the Soviet Union that music could play a very important role. And Van Cliburn and so forth had made a big impression on the Russians and so forth. So when we started up with China, I think the powers that be, which was not me, but they thought that music should be a part of this relationship. And I wasn't involved in the initial decision to bring the orchestra. This was done by President Nixon and Henry Kissinger. But I believe, and knowing Ormandy, I believe Ormandy lobbied very hard for this, and Ormandy usually got what he lobbied for.
Two things happening at the same time, I guess. One is this relationship at this initial stage with a performance coming from one of the most well-known symphony orchestras from the U.S.
Yes.
On a Chinese stage. You are also witnessing the maestro, Normandy, as well-known as he is, as charismatic as he is, literally having himself elevated almost into another world. So what was it like, this combination? And at the same time, you are a young diplomat. This is once-in-a-lifetime experience, in a way.
It was very exciting, and we had to, you know, sort of start from scratch. Ormandy told me at the outset, you know, I really don't like any food except for steaks and chickens, which are prepared by my wife, Gretel, who is a wonderful person. And so I don't think I'm going to come to any dinners. And I said, Maestro, look, if you don't have to eat what you don't want to eat, but you have to realize that all social life in China takes place around the dining room table. If you don't want to meet any Chinese, don't eat Chinese, don't come to dinner. But if you do come, then you'll meet people. And of course, he came, and of course he loved the food, and he ate it very enthusiastically.
Did he eventually react to you? I mean, after this relatively difficult, challenging, but certainly rewarding trip, did he say anything to you?
He was very grateful, and my wife played a big role in this. She's knowledgeable about music, spoke good Chinese, was great looking, and Ormandy...
That wouldn't hurt?
Ormandy liked her, and Ormandy and his wife had a lot of questions about everyday life and things like that. We could try to answer them.
What question did he ask?
He was not, he still was, you know, worried about reaction. And in the first concert, after the first number, which was, I think, a Haydn symphony, I was told that I had to go backstage immediately because the maestro was upset about the reaction. And I found him in backstage, and his wife was fanning him with a big towel, and he was saying, "They're so quiet, they're so quiet. I've never had such a..."
audience he was talking about.
Such a quiet reaction, and this isn't working, this is a disaster. And I said, "Now, maestro, relax. This is China. These people haven't heard a symphony orchestra for a long, long time. And they're very, you know, circumspect about Americans, etc., etc. But I have to say that by Chinese standards, you've gotten a very strong ovation." So he quieted down.
Before you were rushing to Mr. Normandy's studio, I'm sure you were sitting audience, 1973, listening to the performance. Do you still remember what was going through your mind then?
Well, I was concerned, you know. I was wondering about audience reaction. I was worrying about Ormandy's reaction. I was worrying about whether the orchestra itself was going to do all right. I already knew that the orchestra was extremely good at making friends with people, because we were staying at the Minzu Hotel, and the first concert was at the Minzu Concert Hall. But I came to see them the day after they had arrived, and there was a commotion outside, and a big crowd, and frisbees flying around. And the orchestra members had brought their frisbees, and they were throwing them, and people in the street had never seen a frisbee before. They thought that was terrific. And from that moment, the two sides and the peoples really made up their minds that this was going to be a good thing.
It must be a very rewarding process for you as well. If you think back, the very first trip, Philadelphia Symphony Orchestra to China, the very first ice-breaking performance ever taking place between the two countries.
No, it's something that has changed my life too, because that relationship with the orchestra has gone on. And in 2010, when I was back in Shanghai and attending a concert given by the orchestra, people from the orchestra management side saw me and they asked me to come backstage afterwards. And I did, and I met the new president of the orchestra then, that she was wanting to revise the business plan of the orchestra to include China in a much more business-like way. Could I help her with that? And I said, sure. And so I've been doing that more and more intensively ever since. We developed over time was one that took into account the new realities in China.
Yes.
First of all, urbanization. There were now maybe almost 100 new concert halls in China. As each city was developing, they had to have a concert hall. Concert halls were all built, but the question was, you know, now what do we do? How do we fill them? How do we manage them and so forth? And one of the services that we offered was to provide management training for people in China who wanted to get that. The other thing was you had a growing middle class that was enthusiastic about music, able to afford tickets, and anxious that their children, who all were taking music lessons and so forth, hear a great orchestra. And we started this program in 2012, and I was amazed at how young and enthusiastic the Chinese audiences were, and still are.
So it seems there's a lot of changes going on in this country.
Well, I think music is a great bridge between countries, and it's very unforced. It's very natural. People want to cross that bridge.
But Mr. Ambassador, things are always not necessarily as smooth as we always wish it to be. As you may know, there are some bumpy period of time existing between the two countries right now. Coming from where you were, 1973, even before the diplomatic relationship, knowing how much effort over the decades people, including yourself and your wife, put into it. How do you see the current realities?
I see the current realities as a continuum of change and friction. We've always had issues over the years. If you live China-U.S. relations, you know that there are always going to be complications. I see the current complications as part of a continuum. We've been through this before. We'll deal with it. And I won't say that the relationship will not change. It will change. It's been changing since day one. Expect it to change, but expect over time for the two sides to make it clear that they need each other.
Philadelphia Symphony Orchestra this time to Beijing make a lot of people reminiscent of the wisdom and the courage as well as the goodwills many had and have been contributing from day one of this relationship.
Well, I was worried that the trade tensions between us and so forth might get in the way of cultural exchange between the two countries. And I came in January with other leaders of the orchestra to sort of sound things out and see how things were. And I found that the Chinese side was very anxious to have this visit take place. And I came to the conclusion that in times of turbulence, both sides are always looking for something they can agree on. And this seems to be one of them.
In the times of turbulence, both sides are looking for something that they can at least agree upon. Music and culture could be one of those. And that is all the time we have for today.